Prior to Civil War, African Americans were known as property to wealthy white citizens, slaves who worked under harsh conditions with no pay. This was especially terrible in the South. One of the most significant court cases of slavery was the Dred Scott case. This case was in 1857, and it was the Supreme Court case that developed the fact that slaves were property, not persons entitled to constitutional rights. It was the second Supreme Court decision to declare a law unconstitutional, the Missouri Compromise. The pro-slavery Southerners were pleased, but as for the Northern abolitionists, they were outraged that Congress didn't have the power to prohibit slavery. After the Civil War, treatment and rights for African Americans turned for the better, starting with the Freedmen's Bureau, which was made to help African Americans who were left homeless and jobless after the Civil War. Soon after, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were made, ending slavery, granting citizenship and voting rights. Shortly after, raged Confederates created an organization called the Ku Klux Klan, which was a secret society that used terror and violence to keep African Americans from expressing their civil rights and enforce Jim Crow laws. Although African Americans were legally given the right to vote, Jim Crow laws were made to prevent them from using their rights. Although African Americans were legally citizens, they were not socially accepted by society. They had yet to prove themselves. There were many activists for segregation, but the most famous were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington demanded that African Americans better themselves individually to achieve equality, while W.E. Du Bois believed that African Americans should strive for full rights immediately. Socially, African Americans were more accepted during the Harlem Renaissance, which was in the 1920s when they wrote poetry, music, and literature to express feelings and experiences which impressed audiences of all races. In parallel, white artists began incorporating and adapting the Harlem Renaissance styles.
During the American Revolution, women were responsible for managing the household. Instead of wearing or purchasing clothing made for important British materials, women continued a long tradition of weaving and spun their own cloth to make into clothing for their families. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were seen as part of the female responsibility. The ideals of liberty, equality, and independence supported by the Founding Fathers did almost nothing to better women's lives. They continued to be demoted to the home and domestic world and were unwelcomed in political and economic circumstances. Since women were dependent on their husbands, sons, and fathers, they were unable to behave independently in the political and economic area. The Civil War, however, was a great turning point for the equality of women. During the Civil War, American women turned their attention to the world outside the home. Thousands of women in the North and South joined volunteer groups and signed up to work as nurses. It was the first time in American history that women played a significant role in a war effort. By the end of the war, these experiences had expanded Americans' definitions of true womanhood. During the Progressive Era, women had more opportunity for outside-of-home work and began to work in the male-dominating fields. Women also won the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, which was a big step towards equality for women. Although their salaries weren't as high as men, they still got higher wages in the years following the Progressive Era. Women also started raising money for World War I and began to fight for immigrants' right to vote. The 1920s was a big decade of change in politics as well as the workplace, at home, and in education for women. Women started going to college and getting degrees as teachers or as nurses, which was seen as acceptable professions for women. The mills started hiring female floor workers for the first time. Public acceptance for unmarried women began to grow. By the end of the century, 1 in 4 women held a paying job. Women were finally on their path to gaining full equality.
The first large mass of immigrants to arrive in America were Europeans between 1870 and 1920. Many of the immigrants were Italians, Austro-Hungarians, and Russians arriving from every corner of Europe. Oftentimes, the cause of their immigration was due to the desire to escape religious persecution. Others left due to the lack of farmland as a result of the rapid growth in population. For the youth of Europe, those who had the opportunity to immigrate to America saw independence in all its forms. Equality in Europe was much less than in America. During the 1850s and 60s, the first large number of Chinese immigrated to the west coast of America. Most of them came to discover their fortune, among the others during the gold rush. Both the Chinese and Japanese became very important to the development of our nation, assisting in the railroad building, mining, farming, and much more. During 1884, the Japanese allowed Hawaii to recruit Japanese workers for farming. This led to the Japanese immigration booming. Once the U.S. annexed Hawaii, more Japanese began settling in the U.S. Both races believed they would have a better chance of success in a more equal place, only to encounter unequal barriers in the beginning. Changes in education began affecting immigrants by giving them greater possibilities. Unlike African Americans, immigrants were urged to attend school. Many immigrants were children sent by their parents. The parents wanted a better life for their children and believed they could achieve that by attending free public school in America. Here the children became Americanized. Adult immigrants often attended night school, hoping to learn English and the ability to qualify for American citizenship. With the increase in immigration, some native-born Americans were highly opposed to immigration of foreigners beginning in the 1880s. They oftentimes believed keep America for Americans. Some of these anti-immigrant supporters joined groups such as the KKK to belittle and rid of racially different people. This was highly unequal to these people because they only were seeking a new life to avoid belittlement. Urbanization was also a great change due to immigration because most of the immigrants lived in the cities because it was the least expensive and most conducive to their needs. Because of this, immigrants from the same country or of the same language created small communities for comfort. Under America's great developments, people's ideas of equality began to change and develop as well. Much of who each of us is today is due to the chances and changes our nation went through to create a more equal nation for us to live in.